Hey, Stephen. It's John Stone, your old pal. It's my privilege to be able to ask you a couple of questions about your really lovely piece, Writing Dirt, Teaching Noise in the Soundwriting Pedagogies collection. I've got three questions. Just a note, I'm recording this without much professional recording equipment, mostly because I'm not in my office today, and I figured that'd be cool. We're just gonna get some of the ambience of the room that I'm in, and maybe some of the noisiness of the tiny microphone that I'm speaking in. So we'll go ahead and let those noises and imperfections kind of hang in the air. So like I mentioned, I got three questions. One's practical. It's about the composition of the piece. One is more theoretical, kind of asked you to continue your work as a theoretical rhapsodist. And then finally, I got a question about how your students have responded to this pedagogy of noise and dirt. So the first question is fairly straightforward. I'm just interested in hearing you talk a little bit about the composition of the piece. I've now watched and listened and even read the piece several times, and there's some really interesting composition happening. One of the things you teach us in your piece is that noise makes us have to work harder to find the signal. But I also was very cognizant of the ways that you were creating those noises for us to kind of wander through or listen through. And the ways that you chose to go with a clear signal as well, right? Like, so at the beginning of the piece, the introduction, you add some distortion and some kind of weird effects to your voice, but those effects drop off mostly for the rest of the piece, and we get Stephen Hammer, right? Like in a really kind of clear and almost, I don't know, calming, tone with a couple of little glitches along the way. And then there's noises everywhere else. There's visual noise happening on the website itself. There are, you allow us to listen to and through these kind of ambient noises that are underneath. And there's even some interesting textual noise in the transcript. So I'm just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that composing process, about the ways that you were trying to perform the things that you were writing and teaching and talking about. So that's the first question.
Hey John, it's Stephen Hammer. It was really nice to hear your voice and hear your questions, which I thought were real generous and smart and important. So anyway, thanks, and thanks to the folks who are putting this together, and I guess highlighting some of the work that went out in what I think is a pretty good collection. So I liked it, John, that when you opened by talking about the non-fancy equipment that you're using, and I think that's the best kind of equipment, and I guess selfishly, right, because I think it's more honest. It's something to hear or to listen to. It acknowledges that this thing was made. It doesn't just exist, right? And so this is, again, as a researcher and as a teacher, this is just the one real thing that I'm trying to teach in all my classes, and the thing that I'm trying to write about in all my stuff is to, I guess, continue the work of people like Cindy Self and Gail Haywisher, who really inspired me in their pieces like Rhetoric of Technology and so on, in getting us to think about technology not just as a new great thing, but as a thing that either consciously or subconsciously or just by default, we are using composing technologies that have politics, that have values, that have preferences, and that will, I guess in the words maybe of McLuhan, will shape us, will shape the way that we think and we express ourselves, and that we construct ourselves and our communities through these technologies. So I think that's great. I'll kind of respond hopefully in kind, and maybe hopefully it's a little bit strange. But you should hear some noise in what I'm doing now. I've got 4 microphones going right now, and this is partially because I have an installation project going at the moment, and it's in my office all put together. So all my favorite microphones are being used by this project, and instead of unhooking everything and putting it back together, I thought I would just record myself sort of in this system that I've built. I'll explain it to you for just a moment, and maybe this will help you pick apart some of the sounds that you're hearing, as well as my voice. So I have 4 microphones, 2 hydrophones. These are just microphones that are waterproof and that can be submerged, so they're often used traditionally to be submerged in water or some other liquid. I currently have them submerged in soil and in compost. So in my office I have a vermicomposting setup with 2 trays of decomposing material, soil, and worm castings, or worm waste, I guess. The stuff that we really value is actually just worm waste. And I have microphones. Again, I have these 2 hydrophones buried in the dirt, in the filth. And then I have 2 lavalier microphones hovering over the top of the soil, so that I can. Here, I'll lift the lid right now, and maybe we can hear some worms, because they don't like the light very much. And also, of course, changes our hearing or our listening. Now we can hear some worms as well. So we're hearing some worms crawl through the soil around these hydrophones. So you're hearing some of that. You're also hearing, I'm kneeling next to a window. It's about 81 degrees today in Philadelphia, and there's some traffic outside. And I have my windows open because I'm a little bit warm. And I don't like recording myself like this very much. I was never, in the old days when I played music, I hated studio recording. I liked live recording much more, or live performance. So I'm a little bit extra warm, so I'm sitting by the window. So I think this maybe gets at your first question too, John, in terms of thinking about, like, why did you produce this way? I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge this stuff, because I think it's when we see so many finished products in our line of work, and really in just being in our culture. We see things after they've been polished, after they've been edited and proofread and published and produced, that we seldom see the work. And I don't mean this to just acknowledge labor, but to also acknowledge the tools that helped shape that composition. And again, like I said just a few minutes ago, this is really, I think, my job as a teacher, and my job as a researcher is to think about how these things play out. So how did this chapter play out for me? You're right in that there's not a surplus of noise, or maybe not as much noise as you'd like to expect, or as you would think in a chapter about noise. There isn't all that much noise. And this was, partially practical and partially to think about and to perform a concept, I guess, of just contrast. So let me explain, I guess, different parts of it. So you were right in that I think the video provides maybe the most noise. And that really, the style of that video was homage to people like John Cates and other folks working in Chicago Dirty New Media, in that sort of high contrast, high saturation, black and gray, black and white aesthetic. And so I wanted to, that movement and those folks have meant a lot to me intellectually and creatively, and so I try to and maybe poorly, but I try to emulate some of those aesthetics because it is important to me, and I respect that work a great deal. And so there's a little bit of that, but that was also produced that way because I was doing some traveling, not like cool traveling, but living out of a suitcase, and when I didn't really want to, kind of traveling when I was trying to produce this thing at the end. So I didn't have a place I liked in terms of recording video. I didn't really know what I wanted to use for video, and so I started misusing. If you have an Apple computer, you have something called Photo Booth, and on Photo Booth you can essentially produce your own sort of green screen or background. And so I just started misusing that feature a little bit, where I would take that image, and sort of, again, that high contrast black and gray image of myself. And when you set up your green screen, you're supposed to get out of the frame so that it can sort of freeze your background. And I stayed in the background, but real still, so that when I moved, it created these sort of small disturbances in this scene, I guess. The audio, you're right, also, John, in that it wasn't, you didn't get a ton of noise, or maybe you didn't have to do a lot of work to listen through it. And I don't know, maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. I mean, I think the challenge of composing with noise, as my students would definitely tell you, is finding that balance of clarity and noise, right? Because full blast, all day, no contrast noise, maybe in the words of Haggerty, as you talked about in your second question, blast the user into a kind of submission. But if we're trying to create text and also utilize or harness the power of sort of noise, or asking audiences to do work with and for and about, then I think we need to operate, A, with some restraint, and B, understanding contrast. And so what do I mean by contrast? It just started getting sunny in Philadelphia again lately, and every time it gets sunny right around this time of year, when spring finally starts to come after a long winter, on the first sunny day, I say to, or I think to myself, sometimes say to myself, depending on the day, I say, I've been really sad for a while. And I only know I've been feeling sad because I feel all of a sudden so happy, because I'm outside and I have fresh air and I feel the sun on my skin and so on. And that contrast is what makes winter so powerful. That contrast is what makes summer so powerful. And in the same way, I could talk about my apartment in Philadelphia that I hate. I can hear 3 neighbors sometimes at once. And then I travel out of the city for a weekend, and I think, it's so quiet here. I can really, really focus. So I think it's by contrast. And there it goes. I think by contrast sometimes is really important in allowing us to do that work, because I think humans are pretty adaptable and pretty quick learners, right? If you present me with noise consistently, I can adapt to that and I can tune that out, as it were. But if it comes only intermittently or unexpectedly or even randomly, it becomes less predictable. It becomes something that I have a little bit more difficult time adapting to and overcoming. So that's kind of maybe that might be a cop-out a little bit of maybe just not being imaginative in producing that piece or providing noise. And I certainly didn't take that as a critique. But those are a couple things that I certainly talk about with my students, and we work really hard to find that sort of balance between allowing or forcing our readers or our audiences or our listeners into work, and then giving them room to breathe, to listen, to be, before we ask that work of them again.
All right, here's the second question. You know that I'm really interested in music and working on several projects that look at the sonic rhetorics of music, and I it comes up in this piece as well, maybe not quite as explicitly as your focus on noise, but Even still, I was inspired by the theorists that you bring to the conversation. The Russolo, Latour, Douglas Kahn, among others. And then this from Paul Hegarty. Let me quote you a little bit, or quote him. And he's talking about noise music. He says, "The listener struggles to find a way through, in, or above the noise music, but gives up at a certain point. Rhythms are to be found, frequencies to be followed. It is not just random, but eventually the listener is pulverized into believing there is a link. Noise music becomes ambience, not as you learn how to listen, or whether you accept its refusal to settle, but when you are no longer in a position to accept or deny." Super interesting. So that resonates in both kind of harmony and dissonance with a theorist that you didn't bring to this conversation, Jacques Attali. And so I'm going to put these two people in conversation and ask you for your thoughts about it. So here's what Attali says about noise and music. All music, Attali writes, is, quote, inscribed between noise and silence in the space of the social codification it reveals. Every code of music is rooted in the ideologies and technologies of its age, and at the same time produces them. That's the end of this quote. I'll return to it in a second. But from this, I gather that music is a kind of symbiote with its noisy contexts, and that, here's Attali again, quote, "Listening to music is listening to all noise, realizing that its appropriation and control is a reflection of power, that it is essentially political." So I wonder if I can get the theorist Stephen Hammer's take on this Hegarty-Attali pairing, particularly the ways that music, and maybe not just necessarily noise music, invites us to kind of critically think through and about these, quote, ideologies and technologies of our age. So that's my doozy question. Feel free to take it however, in whatever direction you want. But again, I'm just interested in those connections between noisiness and ideology and technology and music, and maybe you have some thoughts there.
Your second question, I think, is really, really good too. I don't know if I'll do a very good job of answering it, but I'll certainly give it a shot. I think bringing in Attali is really, really important, and bringing in notions of how music, how the technologies and ideologies of music are political, and certainly how noise is political. And John, this is really why I wanted to bring in the work of Mary Douglas, and certainly Kristeva has a really good response to Douglas, an extension of, in abjection. But what Douglas talks about that I find so valuable to this kind of work is to thinking about dirt and filth, taboo, and how to bring noise into that same conversation. So Douglas talks about, this is her book, Purity and Danger, talking about dirt is matter out of place, right? And it only and because it's out of place, it also, it becomes the disorder. And in order to have dirt, we need to have a system in place that refuses or rejects or is repulsed by it. So she really helped me think through some of these concepts of noise, and really got me obviously into doing projects like I'm doing now, which is actually engaging directly with dirt and sound. So for me, in thinking through music, the tools and the technologies, in other words, the instruments, in the same way that that we know a word processor like Microsoft Word, or the QWERTY keyboard, or a number 2 pencil, are all tools, and none of them are just tools. They're all political and value-laden technologies that shape the way we think, act, write, love, live. So too are our instruments, the acoustic guitar, the electric guitar, the distortion pedal, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So I think examining these tools, the way they interact with and affect and are affected by ideologies, is super important to think through and about and certainly something that I think about when I read work on music like yours and other folks in our field doing that kind of work, which is super interesting and valuable. So I can give you an example. I'm working with a student on a summer research project in which we're trying to unpack the ideologies and technologies of production tools in hip hop and R&B, and he's a talented musician, and also one of my majors, and we started talking about a project like this when we started talking about artists like Jay Dilla, and tools like Akai's MPC samplers, and like 707, 808, 909 drum machines, and the way that those instruments really shape genres, movements of music that also then, pack their own ideologies and politics, right? So, very briefly, we're talking about the ways that the imprecision on an Akai MPC juxtaposes with a really discrete 16-step sampler or a 16-step sequencer that you would find on, a Roland drum machine, and the ways that, one led to sort of a Jay Dilla style hip hop, and one led to more use in things even like house and acid and generally dance music, and the way that those two movements, those two communities, those two genres sort of interact with and give and take with the technologies that make the sound around which communities form. So I think it's super important to think about in music. It just isn't something that I always put really face forward in this work and in some other work. But I think it's super important. I'm glad you brought it up. It's something that I'll pay attention to certainly more as I write more about this.
All right. I got one last question for you, Stephen. This has been fun. It's like almost like you're in the room. So here's this last question. And it kind of builds on the last question's implications, but in this case for student learning. In part 3 of your chapter, I love how you invite students, once they become aware of the presence and possibilities of noise, to, and I'm going to quote you, turn this awareness and these sonic practices outward as political action. Wow. You then ask them a series of questions. Here are some of those questions. Where do they see injustice or exclusion? Where do they see the myth of noiselessness being promoted, applied, and enforced? Where is the system? Where is the noise in the seemingly noiseless system? How can they find ways to corrupt or disrupt, or in order to expose and spread awareness? And how might they remind themselves of the systems in which they live and are expected to function noiselessly? What amazing questions. For my question for you, I'm just curious as to how they have responded as you've posed these questions for students. If you can maybe think of a couple of examples, an anecdote, a project, just something about the ways that students have answered these questions.
Your last question, in thinking about students, which I kind of just talked about, I guess, a little bit with this particular summer project, but how do students respond to this? To these questions. I'm really flattered that you think they're good questions. They're questions I've been really working on for a long time, and certainly I try to bring into all my classes. How do my students answer these questions? And sometimes I think those questions are answered in kind of predictable ways. I think we have, because we live in the same sort of place. A lot of my students have sort of shared backgrounds and experiences. And so generally I think we're irritated by the same things sonically. We find the same things to be noisy or inconvenient or frustrating or whatever. Whether that's construction or lack of parking or how the bus doesn't come on time, or right, these things that signify breakage or dysfunction within systems, which we could, again, call sort of this idea of noise. So how do they respond to these questions? Well, I think they do a lot of projects that require this kind of listening, this kind of analysis that asks us to think about the relationship between signal, noise, and culture, and how to play. So here are some examples. I teach glitch studies. This is like the work of especially folks like Rosa Minkman, who wrote the Glitch Studies Manifesto. I think this is really important to teach in the department that I teach in. Because I find most of my students to be really good consumers of technology, but when we talk culturally, sometimes we talk about, our students are really good at making or at technology. But I would say mostly that they're really good consumers, and so what our job is to kind of think about what in this invisible media environment has shaped us in ways that we don't understand all the time. And so I teach things like glitch, and I talk about what kind of programs we use to do schoolwork and so on, and then I teach them kind of a basic glitch art technique called databending. So a good example of this would be to open up a JPEG, not in something like Preview, again, if you're using an Apple, but to open it in Audacity or open it in a text editor. So you can, when you double-click something in the operating system that I'm using, that operating system makes a decision for me, right? It chooses to interpret that data in a certain way, to represent it to me in a certain way. And so one of the things I ask my students to do is to make that image noisy. So you would open up a JPEG in a text editor, alter the text, and it starts to give what you would call a glitch aesthetic, or perhaps a post-glitch aesthetic, depending on how you look at that. And so then I'll ask them to do things like, okay, well, if the idea of glitch is to use technological means to create error, to draw attention to something, what kind of images would you databend? So they'll do things, like taking photoshopped magazine covers and have sort of discussions on
for having this pseudo conversation with me. I look forward to our next meeting, where we will certainly reminisce about this virtual question and answer session between John Stone and Stephen Hammer. Thank you, sir.